Welcome to our second Digital Dialogues webinar, a biannual webinar series crafted for individuals enthusiastic about cyber strategy. In each succinct 30-minute episode, we deliver insightful discussions, providing you invaluable insights and knowledge to navigate the complex world of cyber strategy. Designed for intellectual engagement and community building, this series serves as a union between experts, students, and aficionados alike, where they share, learn, and foster a deeper appreciation of the digital landscape. I am Dr. Mark Regerzewski, Assistant Professor of Cybersecurity at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and I'll be guiding you through this fascinating journey in the ever-evolving field of cyber strategy. Let me welcome our guest, Dr. Max Smeets. He is the author of No Shortcuts: Why States Struggle to Develop a Military Cyber Force. Dr. Smeets is a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich and director of the European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative. Also, he's an affiliate at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation and a Royal United Services Institute RUSI Associate Fellow. Dr. Smeets received a BA in Economics, Politics, and Statistics and a master's and doctorate in international relations from the University of Oxford. Welcome, Max.
It's a real pleasure to be here, Mark. I'm really excited for this conversation and for the people that were listening in. I apologize for the 2-minute delay. It's not very Swiss, but excited to get started.
Great. So, Max, I really enjoyed your book, and you brought out a lot of aspects to cyber strategy that I think the larger public does not know about. From my own background, I came from the Department of Defense and also dealt with cyber strategy. Can you please summarize the main arguments of your book, No Shortcuts, and the logic undergirding it?
Sure. To summarize it, let me start actually with an observation, or a dual observation. The book came out of the fact that I saw two different trends. The first trend was an institutionalization of military cyber forces. So what we have seen over the past decades is this growth of different countries establishing not only small units, but entire cyber commands, develop strategies, and of course call this domain cyberspace a domain of warfare. But whilst we have seen an institutionalization of military cyber efforts, when we actually look at the activity, we see relatively few countries conducting military cyber operations, and particularly what we call effect operations. Effect operations are those operations that seek to disrupt, deny, degrade, and/or destroy. So whilst we see this rise of all these cyber commands being established, it's a select group of countries that we know of are conducting these operations in the military realm. So what explains that gap? Now, one could be visibility. And clearly, we are not seeing everything in this space, and especially in the espionage realm, but we're probably missing a lot in the military realm too. So that explains probably part of the gap. The second element is what the great majority of literature has focused on. The argument is, well, actually, it's because cyber operations, whilst these commands are established, are not really effective tools for coercion, or they're not really effective tools for other forms of signaling. Perhaps they are more used in this intelligence context. Now, that's the entire body of literature that we know today in cyber conflict. But it starts with a presumption, and that is that states have already crossed the barriers of entry and are actually capable of conducting cyber effect operations. And the key argument of this book, which is the title, not coincidentally, the subtitle of the book, is that states really struggle to develop a military cyber force. And these barriers of entry are much higher than many people think.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate the case study you do on the Netherlands in the book. And you mentioned how the Netherlands has stood up their own cyber command. Could you briefly tell us about, just because the Netherlands set up their own cyber command, that maybe they have not fully matured to doing cyber effect operations? Could you speak to that?
Sure, it's a fascinating case, and a case that I've been following for over a decade. Before even the command was established, I had the opportunity to meet with the then colonel who became commander and see the sort of early kind of operational infrastructure that was there, and I've seen the thinking change over time. Now, the Netherlands is a quite illustrative case, because what we see in the Netherlands is a country that clearly has a lot of intelligence capability, and the intelligence services are known for some really major operations, including one against Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. These are two groups operating from Russia. But the military, since its existence, which is now a decade, has never conducted a single operation. And in part, that comes from its mandate. Its mandate is to only operate in wartime. And as it is only allowed to operate in wartime, it needs a parliamentary mandate, and the Dutch are not going to war in lots of different places. It ultimately have created a cyber command that may have some deterrent capability just by its existence, but it's not doing this day-to-day operational activity on the ground. Now, someone could say that's fair, that's how other military organizations operate as well. But it does lead to problems, because if you only have this wartime mission, and in peacetime, it's the realm of the intelligence agencies to operate, or potentially other entities, how do you then recruit, retain, and train the talent that is needed for these cyber commands? And that's a big struggle, right? Because, you know, you're not going to sit around quite literally for a couple of years waiting for that exciting mission to come, especially if a cyber command doesn't have the mission or is not allowed to do what we call OPE, operational preparation of the environment. If they are not allowed to do that, if this is in the hands of their intelligence services, then all you can do is essentially train on cyber ranges or do potentially some defensive activities on your own networks. And in most countries, the military is only allowed to do defensive activity on their own military networks. As a military mandate, they wouldn't be allowed to go onto civilian networks or even beyond that. So there's a real conundrum then how to overcome this. And in that sense, the Dutch are truly illustrative for what we see in a lot of particularly European countries.
Fascinating. So in the book, you mentioned that not all countries have the wherewithal to operate in cyberspace effectively, and that successful actions depend on things like money, talent, personnel, training, and coordination. In the 2 years or 3 years, 4 years since you've made that observation, have you seen any more states pursuing military cyber programs?
So that's a really interesting question, right? And this goes back to the first distinction that I made. We have seen an institutionalization, a further institutionalization of this space in a number of different ways, where indeed, you know, you may have a Belgian who will now say that they have a cyber command that is now operational. Or even at the higher level, you see a growing number of countries that have said that we will offer our so-called sovereign cyber effects to the NATO alliance in case that is required. And so what we have seen over those last 3 years is that further institutionalization. But when we then look at the activity still today, the great majority of those countries have still not conducted an effect operation. It hasn't changed for a country like Germany or the Netherlands. And so the key underlying trend remains the same, as the structural conditions also haven't changed. Now, that said, we do see some interesting other developments, and these actually are also taking place in the space outside of the realm of states, in the realm of non-states. And one that I think is particularly worth mentioning, but there are multiple, is the Belarusian cyber partisans. Here we see the first real resistance movement in this space, a non-state group that is operating against the Belarusian state and has actually been quite significant in its cyber operations, where it has, for instance, during the further invasion of Ukraine, has significantly disrupted the railway network in Ukraine, going towards Ukraine from Belarus, influencing some of the transportation. It has also done other activities that are outside of what we call effect operations, for instance, the release of a wide range of documentation of Belarusian officials, including some video calls from Belarusian officials with their mistresses, clearly showing friction within the government. And some of those developments, I think, deserve more attention than they have deserved today.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we would touch upon it later, Mark, but of course there is one entity that also deserves further discussion, and I'm happy to go into the Q&A there, and that's Ukraine itself. But maybe we can park that for now and come back to that later.
Yes, fantastic. We definitely have to talk about the IT army of Ukraine for sure. So, given the public exposure of cyber capabilities in places like Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, do you believe that the strategic reservations that you speak about in your book, particularly about doubts regarding the anticipated benefits of cyber operations, will be relaxed among those previously reluctant to conduct cyber operations?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, right? And so the observation I make in my book, in the middle part of the book, is also a dual one, and it's maybe worth teasing out, right? The first is one about the constraints that different countries face. In short, we see sort of twofold: some countries that are highly constrained strategically, organizationally, and legally, right? They would have to conduct an operation like it wasn't the case with the US until several years ago, where it had to sometimes go up all the way to the presidential level to conduct an effect operation, where it had to go through a whole entire legal process which assessed, the potential for collateral damage and so on and so on. There are significant constraints to even conduct any type of activity, whereas other countries are much less constrained when it comes to either legal, strategic, or organizational. We could delve into each of those in detail and pick a country. But the point is, the resources required to conduct operations disproportionately increase with each additional constraint added. So the moment you have to really carefully think about collateral damage, for example, you suddenly need to understand the target network so much better. You need to have scanned it so much longer. You need to have been in that network so much longer to write that collateral damage assessment report beforehand. And you have to think so much more carefully about alternative scenarios, about how you're going to develop your operational capability, that the resources for what initially might seem a simple operation to wipe some data off a network suddenly triple, quadruple, and the people that are involved in it as well. And it's that dynamic that we see. And I do think, indeed, that as the sort of pressure builds up among certain countries, there might be a tendency to loosen that up. And a case that not perfectly fits, and now we already get back to it, is Ukraine, as you mentioned. And why? Is because, here we have a country that, interestingly enough, didn't establish a cyber command, right? It's now thinking about establishing a cyber command. It didn't before. Instead, it had to rely, as the war started, on Ukrainian IT army, as you mentioned, that is officially a non-state group, of course, with connections to the state, but it's not deeply integrated within the state with a clear command structure, and that has been established within the constitution several years ago. And clearly, what the Ukrainian IT army does, as well as several other groups, you do see a degree of relaxation, at least from the Ukrainian government, around the activity that you will allow in these cases in such a high pressure environment, which I would suspect you would maybe not allow maybe several years ago or in other environments.
Great insight. So I'd like to remind our audience that they can feel free to drop questions into the Q&A box, and hopefully we can get to your questions. Max, I want to ask you about organizational challenges, and I've seen this firsthand with policymakers and senior leaders, differing in their cyber terminology and using cyber and really just talking past each other when talking about cyber. In your view, has this discrepancy persisted since you made that initial observation, or are cyber programs and their associated terminology becoming more institutionalized?
Interesting. So what we've seen is one thing, I'm not sure if it has become more institutionalized, but what we have seen now is more formal training programs over the past few years. And what started initially as formal training programs that were nationally based, increasingly we see countries working together to create training programs across different countries. And this can happen, I'm teaching a module at the NATO Defense College every year, the Cyber Defense module, where you bring, NATO countries together to teach senior officers on some of the key concepts in cyberspace. It happens at the highest level, But we also see with new initiatives, for instance, in Portugal, where different countries come together at the operational level. And you see really at the action level with different exercises that are being done. And all of these efforts are being intensified. And as these efforts are intensified, I think what you do see is a sort of dynamic of, I'm not sure convergence, but you see a bit more mimicking, a bit more speaking the same language that you saw before. At the same time, these countries, each of these countries are still established in its unique way. And, a unique setup in which the intelligence is even allowed to operate with the military, and in other countries, it's much harder to do. And so they have to deal with their own sort of internal constraints. And to give you an example, you see this with the US, which has a cyber command that now follows officially, has a vision of persistent engagement following under the DoD strategy of Defend Forward, a more active strategy. Now you see the UK most recently with a new national cyber force also adopting its own active strategy, but they term it slightly different. And it's also situated slightly different. In the UK, it's really a deep integration between intelligence and the military, whereas in the US, it's, whilst at the highest level, you have the commander being dual-headed with the NSA and Cyber Command, at the operational level, it's still two separate organizations. And so, whilst they have the same vision, same idea that you need to be more active, same idea of the threat landscape in a great number of ways, considering the different country setups, they are also differently established.
We've already got a few questions in from the audience here. If I can get the first question here that I wanted to address, comes from Sophia. She asks, would it be more efficient if they sourced the employees from the intel services rather than retaining dedicated employees outside of wartime?
That's a brilliant question. And actually, there are a couple of countries that have started doing this more. And the one that, to the benefit of this conversation, the one country that is experimenting with this a lot more is the Netherlands, indeed, where the intelligence services who are doing this day-to-day operational activity will indeed potentially help during critical mission needs and perhaps even physically move to the military units. Now, of course, it creates some problems for the cyber command, because then it almost becomes a sort of, some have given terms like an outsourcing agency. Other than a shell, what is it then really, right? So there is that element, but clearly that is something that you already see. Now, there are, however, a couple of questions that come with this, and they depend on country to country. But one that is a more general one, and that I write about in the book, is the potential implications if your intelligence operations really start to look like your military operations. Now, what I mean with this is, in this space, it's quite hard to know each other's intentions. And some would have argued that there is a so-called cybersecurity dilemma, that because you don't know each other's intentions, you may want to get even access to these other networks to better understand what they're doing, that ultimately leads to a spiral of escalation. Now, the danger with having intelligence activities being deeply integrated with the military is that for the adversary, it's harder to know, hey, we've seen this activity before, and previously this was associated with an effect operation, so we're going to escalate. Whereas, you're actually now using these similar tactics, techniques, and procedures and accessing these networks and so on, because you only want to do intel collection. So it becomes harder to even distinguish. The second, where there's a difference, is if at the operational level and the way you even develop your malware, the intel operations and the military operations become similar, what then happens is so-called, we put basically our eggs in one basket. Because if there is so much code overlap between a military operation and an intel operation, if a military operation gets discovered, it's very likely that our intel operations get discovered as well. And so you see then that whilst it seems efficient, it might also lead to greater inefficiencies down the road. And the most famous example of that is the most famous operation, which is Stuxnet. Stuxnet, a knowingly visible operation, against net towns that ultimately came out. And, it was connected actually to a range of Intel platforms. Doku 2.0 are two of the most famous ones there. These two would probably not have been as discovered as quickly if it wasn't for Stuxnet. But because of the code overlap, it meant that people could really hunt for these intelligence activities as well.
Yeah, taking a step further, military operations are treated one way in international law. Espionage activities are treated a separate way. Might there be some sort of confusion by an adversary state if they assume that an espionage operation is a military operation? How might that affect how they respond?
That's indeed one of the key questions, right? Will they be willing to respond, maybe even also outside of cyberspace? And so then we get into the cross kind of dimension, cross domain dimension, which is crucial to consider here, right? Cyberspace doesn't operate in isolation. What we have seen, and you alluded to in some of your questions, ultimately cyberspace follows the geopolitical tendencies that are going on, whether this is conflict hotspots in Israel and hopefully not, but it may happen in the future in the case of Taiwan. And so that becomes the key question there on how this might then lead to more escalatory dynamics.
Right. So we have a question here from the dean of our college, Dr. Hoffman, who asks, what are the barriers that prevent us, the US, from defending against criminal government-sponsored groups from Russia or China?
Oh, I'm glad that this question is being asked. Not least because the book I'm currently writing is on ransomware operations. So I've pivoted slightly into different directions from military to ransomware, not least because I think it has become such a significant problem. I will try to keep the answer short though, because I see that there are quite a few other questions in the chat. But in short, we see a number of things that can be done to disrupt ransomware activity. This can be operationally, so it can include going after command and control infrastructure, or what I think is the most effective operational disruption is going after the Bitcoin wallets of some of the biggest criminals. We know, for instance, of the biggest group that existed in 2021, 2022, called Conti. The head of that group has a Bitcoin wallet there of at least 80 million. Being able to access that disrupts not only his, private life, but the resources available to some of these groups. Now, interestingly, and we've seen this with some of the disruptions recently, is also friction organizationally, right? Whether this is as simple as arrest or whether this is as simple as asking for rewards, all the way to arrests. But at the same time, this is also where the biggest limitation comes in. Arrests, especially in the current climate, are extremely challenging to do and unrealistic. We have seen a couple of instances where it did happen prior to the further invasion of Ukraine, but we shouldn't expect to happen it today. And I'm skeptical that that will take place. Now, the last thing that I would say, though, that has been insufficiently explored is disrupting the branding of ransomware groups. Ultimately, these ransomware groups depend on a reputation, right? Because they are essentially first deceiving you to get access, extorting you, but then they rely on trust. Because you need to trust that they are able to decrypt your device and that they will not leak that information online. They develop a reputation and a brand around that to build up that trust. Disrupting their reputation, that is I think, one that can be further done. The worst thing that can happen to a group, a ransomware group, is that the first 10 search results on Google show that something like this group doesn't pay, or this group doesn't, decrypt. Well, then they have to rebrand. They have to rethink their entire model, and some of the affiliates will have to move to other groups.
That's great.
Hopefully more on that later in the next book.
Yes.
I'll happily come back then.
Absolutely. We look forward to it. So we have time for one more question. It comes from Professor Harry Brodeen. How could the West better leverage civilian cyber capabilities to create these types of effects against Russia?
That's a tricky question, right? So one of the things we have to be clear about is that civilian groups have been extremely effective, and including the private sector, but civilians as a whole, in defending against Russia. If there is one thing that we can say about, particularly the Ukrainian case, is the ability to collectively step up and respond, that has massively benefited Ukraine, whether this is from moving towards more cloud infrastructure to really getting much better visibility of where some of these Russian actors operate. The tricky question, though, comes in to what degree should we allow for the participation of civilians in any Western country to go out and hack Russian infrastructure? And there we have to ask tough questions to ourselves, because there have been several instances where this is the case, where there might be let's take an almost cartoonish version, the Spanish kid in the basement or whatever it might be, that is disrupting some critical infrastructure in Russia. Clearly, this is not the type of activity that we would normally allow. How are we going to deal with these type of people? Will we, have them in front of a court, or will we be more milder in our responses? These are tough questions that, quite frankly, I do not always see addressed in public spaces.
I agree. And I think the Ukraine conflict is making us go back and ask some of these very same questions that you're talking about. Max, I'd really like to thank you for your time today. Audience, I'd really like to thank you for your time as well. I know there was several questions in there that we could not get to. I do highly recommend Max's book. It's available here in our library on campus. The title of that book is No Shortcuts, and it addresses why some states pursue military cyber capabilities while others do not. Max, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your time. And anyone who has questions, also feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer them in that way.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to having you back for your next book.
Pleasure. I'll be on time that time.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.